Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Benny Morris's One State, Two States, Resolving the Israel-Palestine Conflict. I've done a review for this book on my Stephen Heiner channel. I'll put a link for that in the description as well as a card. And so rather than redo that review, which was a fairly short review anyway, I'm simply going to read from towards the end where Benny discusses the one-state solution possibility. This is a solution I've come to agree with, and so I'm going to read through what he has to say and agree or disagree, or I might just read it straight through. We'll see. There is an unavoidable logic to the one state solution. In strictly geographical terms, Palestine, or the land of Israel, is indeed one country. The green lines established in the Israel Jordan and Israel Egypt armistice agreements of 1949, separating the West Bank and Gaza Strip from the State of Israel, are completely artificial. Though the same can be said of the international boundary established in 1923 between Palestine and Lebanon. The Litani River, geographically, if not demographically, would have made much more sense. On the other hand, the Jordan River, and then the Dead Sea and the Arava Rift or Wadi Araba, are a natural boundary between the land lying to the west, Palestine, and Syria and Transjordan, now Jordan, in the east. The division of Palestine into three parts, Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, also makes little sense in terms of a variety of resources and services. The country's water resources cannot countenance such an artificial division. The hill country aquifers in the Galilee, Samaria, Judea highlands necessarily also serve the lowlands below. Nor can a logical sewage system be defined and constructed separately for the West Bank. Today, many Palestinian towns and villages and industries channel their sewage into the streams that flow downhill, westward, into Israel and the Mediterranean. Haifa and Ashdod are natural ports for the whole of Palestine, and the establishment of a political entity or state in the West Bank without these maritime outlets makes little sense. Indeed, the very shape and smallness of the land of Israel, Palestine, about 50 miles from east to west, which is the Jordan to the Mediterranean, also known as the river to the sea, makes its division into two states a practical nightmare and well nigh unthinkable. But over the past century, demography has trumped geography, and the prospect of fashioning one state for the two peoples that inhabit the country is even more illogical and unrealistic than the geopolitical division of the country. If it's going to be a Jewish state. In ruling back in July 1937 against a binational state, the Peel Commission explained about 1 million Arabs are in strife, open or latent, with some 400,000 Jews. Why is that, Benny? Why did the Peel Commission state that? Why was the Peel Commission unable to say, because of British policies that increased immigration into Palestine without consultation with the local population or permission of the local population, this is what happened? There is no common ground between them because you created a feud where one did not exist prior to 1917. The Arab community is predominantly Asiatic in character, the Jewish community predominantly European. There's a bit of clash of civilizations narrative here. That's a topic for another time. They differ in religion and language, so do lots of people who live together in many other parts of the world. Their cultural and social life, their ways of thought and conduct are as incompatible as their national aspirations. That's simply an assertion. Indeed, both the Zionist and Palestine Arab political leaderships thought and said as much at the time. Musa Kazim al-Husseini, head of the Palestine Arab Executive, the first leadership body of the Palestine Arab National Movement, put it pithily back in 1922. Nature does not allow the creation of a spirit of cooperation between two peoples so different. And of course, it was not just a matter of difference. Arab hatred of the Jews was so profound as to make a common polity an impossibility. So there's two problems here. First of all, whoever he may be, Musa Kazim al-Husseini, does not speak for the entire Palestinian people. Anytime that you want a national decision, you're going to have a referendum. Secondly, the idea that Arab hatred of the Jews was so profound as to make a common polity an impossibility flies in the face of hundreds of years of Jewish-Muslim coexistence within a single polity known as the Ottoman Empire. So Benny Morris, the historian, is seemingly ignoring history and focusing on the troubles of the current period to then make a statement, Arab hatred of the Jews was so profound. Arabs and Jews lived together for centuries in many places, not just Palestine. As Lord Peel wrote to Colonial Secretary William Ormsby Gore as he was preparing the Royal Commission report, though I knew there was ill feeling between Jews and Arabs, I had not realized the depth and intensity of the hatred with which the Jews are held by the Arabs. Doesn't mention anything about how the Jews feel about the Arabs. And I did not realize how deep-seated was the Arab fear of Jewish overlordship and domination. Why would they think that? Keep in mind, Peel Commission's in 1937. The Arab Revolt starts in 1936 after years and years and years of trying to work with the English and try to have their voice heard, and years and years and years of the English trying to manufacture consent from the Palestinians for the takeover of their land. Yeah, there's going to be some resentment and there's going to be some hatred, not just towards the Jews for what they're doing, but for the British, towards the British for supporting it. Nothing has changed since 1937. Or more accurately, things have changed mainly in directions that make the establishment of a viable binational state even less likely than 70 years ago. During the intervening decades, the fear and hatred of the other in each community have grown considerably. As a result, on the Jewish side, of the bouts of Arab terrorism, which have progressively increased in viciousness and scope. Again, he doesn't talk about the Jewish terrorism that has progressively increased in viciousness and scope. I wouldn't say progressively, I would say geometrically. And the growing Islamization and political radicalization of the Palestinian Arabs. Why did that happen, Benny? And on the Arab side, as a result of their violent defeat, displacement, and dispossession in 1948, the subsequent bouts of Israeli counter-terrorist operations, repression of legitimate resistance operations that have often resulted in substantial civilian death, and the grinding, stifling Israeli occupation of the territories that has contributed substantially to the psychological, political, and economic misery of the inhabitants since 1967. And we have to give Benny credit here for the correct wording he uses. He talks about defeat, displacement, and dispossession in 1948. He was one of the first Israeli historians to say such a thing, and he was attacked for saying so. And he also mentions this has contributed to the psychological, political, and economic misery of the inhabitants since 1967, and he attributes that to the Israeli, and he uses the word occupation. If Arab expressions in the early years of the 20th century of fear of eventual displacement and expulsion by the Zionists were largely propagandistic, they were not. Today, in view of what has happened, they are very real. And if Jewish fears in the 1930s of Arab intentions to push them into the sea, to destroy the Zionist enterprise and perhaps slaughter the Yishuv, were, if heartfelt, unrealistic, today they are very real, as are Jewish fears of a nuclear holocaust at Islamic hands. So, a couple of things here. The Zionist enterprise has to be destroyed. That's the only way for any solution to come about here. The idea of a supremacist Jewish state has to be destroyed. Benny Morris is a Zionist. He doesn't like that, so he doesn't admit that as a possibility. But the Zionist enterprise has to be destroyed. The slaughter of the Yishuv, no. The idea that the Zionist enterprise has to be destroyed and that the Jews have to be killed, I don't see that as connected. There are different ways that Jews throughout the world exist in polities. There are plenty of Jews who live in Russia. There's plenty of Jews who live in South America or in the United States. They live under different political systems. So Jews do not require a Jewish state in order to live, exist, thrive, build families, build their businesses. They don't. The thesis that was put together by the Zionists was that you have to have a Jewish state, and it's our refuge. And instead, what has proven, the counter thesis is actually true. It's actually much worse for the Jews to have a Jewish state. It causes all sorts of problems, not least due to the fact that the Jewish state is so brutal to everybody around them and has been a bully for decades. These fears and hatreds make a shared binational state in which each community inevitably would seek to dominate the other, if only to prevent the other's domination of itself, inconceivable. We do have models for other situations that are not necessarily amazingly wonderful, but they still exist. Bosnia, I think, being the key one, where you've got the Serbs and the Bosniaks and the Bosnians all living together. And they manage to survive crisis after crisis, but they're not murdering each other on the streets, and there's not one occupying the other. So people who are unlike and who have fears and sometimes hatreds of each other can still live together in peace, even after everything that Israel has done. In the one-state solution, Virginia Tilley writes at length about Arab hatred of Israel and the Jews, in the end dismissing it as marginal and ephemeral. In effect, she denies Jewish assertions that the Arabs hate the Jews or Israel, and poo-poos the argument that in a one-state solution, the Arabs would quickly doom Jewish Israelis to marginalization, oppression, and even expulsion. The Arabs, it is believed, have always sworn to throw the Jews into the sea and will do so at the first opportunity. Israel's remaining a Jewish state is therefore argued as an imperative against persistent Arab and Muslim hostility. Tilley argues, on the contrary, that although Arabs are certainly not immune from anti-Semitism, Arab language against the Jews is a response primarily to the explicit Zionist privileging of the Jews and to the Palestinian expulsion and dispossession. No, Arabs do not really hate the Jews, she writes, and again we have to look at the evidence of history. Jews and Muslims lived together, with Christians as well, in Palestine for centuries in peace, without any major problems. So we have to look at the history. What has happened in the last 70 years has been a historical anomaly which has created problems. So Morris wants to look at that as the reality. Because this has happened, this is it. We can change. We can go back to ways of existing with each other. That is possible. But what is not possible is that this continue. The Zionist murder, genocide, occupation, this cannot continue forever. Just on a natural level, it's not sustainable for the Israeli state. They don't have the ability to do it forever. For example, take the suicide bombers who for more than a decade now have haunted Israel's buses and restaurants. Relative to the scope of the military occupation and the size of the Palestinian population under occupation, suicide bombings and other attacks, despite their broadly terrifying impact, have remained a tiny fringe phenomenon, she writes. But Tilley ignores the broad popularity that these suicide bombings enjoyed and still enjoy in the Palestinian cities, ignores the crowds that swamped the streets of Ramallah and Gaza, and Nablus when news of a success in Tel Aviv or Haifa, ignores the Fatah Hamas custom of handing out sweets to passers-by with each successful bombing, and ignores the veneration the bombers are accorded in all West Bank and Gaza schools, their postered faces looking down from walls in every classroom. I've said this before, I don't know why I have to keep saying it, but I suppose I do for anyone who will show up in the comment section. I condemn suicide bombing in any form, in any situation. It is a highly immoral act, offensive to God and offensive to our fellow men. So I will never condone suicide bombing. But everything that Morris is mentioning here are the desperate reactions of people who are looking for any kind of victory against their occupier. So I understand it. I don't approve it. But to pretend that this is what people dream of, they wake up in the morning and they hope that one of their children will suicide themselves in order to strike a blow against the occupier, is nutty. And surely Morris knows that. Surely Morris knows that's not how Palestinian society is constituted. Second, the relatively small numbers of successful suicide bombings during the years 1993 through 2008 was a function more of Shin Bet and IDF prevention and interdiction and the security fence than of Palestinian inhibitions or restraint. The suicide bombings, as every poll among Palestinians has shown, were and remain immensely popular. It's lamentable, but again, I say, I understand, while not approving, that these are the lengths of desperation that the Palestinians have been pushed through. I wish that they would not engage in it, but I understand why. And, once again, for the record, I condemn it. Tilley goes on, the mass behavior of nearly 2.5 million Palestinians under occupation indicates that the vast majority of Palestinians remain impressively resistant to outright racial hatred. The enemy is Israel and Zionism, not Judaism per se. The Jews are feared and detested because they incarnate the occupation policy that oppresses Palestinians. Tilley adds that, although Arab and Palestinian rhetoric certainly called for expelling Jewish settlers from Palestinian land, they never seriously suggested their physical annihilation on anything like the racial terms of National Socialism. She compares Palestine-Israel to what happened in Algeria in the 1960s and says that the Arab societies in both deemed settler colonization illegitimate, but she fails to note that in the Algerian case, the Arabs ended up driving out the country's million-odd white settlers, lock, stock, and barrel. That's true, but those settlers came from mainland France, so they had a place to go back to, which is where they came from. That couldn't be the case here. The Jews who came from various different places, they couldn't be driven back to Yemen or Iraq or Morocco or Poland or wherever they came from, because many years have passed and people are now attached to the land. There has to be a lot of grace given for the fact that, despite the fact that the Jews are there illegally and in many ways immorally, The solution is not to commit another crime to them in the sense of forcing them to become refugees as well. That there has to be in this solution a healing for both sides, not to commit another trauma to someone else in response to the original trauma that was committed on the Palestinians. There has to be a healing here, and that means that there has to be a great amount of understanding, which the Palestinians have already extended. But I think they will have to extend it just a little bit further in order to make this work. Ignoring the ample evidence provided by Hamas, Tilly discounts charges of Arab Judeophobia or anti-Semitism. Of course, there is anti-Semitism in all communities, she concedes, but evidence of Arab anti-Semitic racism is so thin that Zionist accusations commonly must center on just one genuinely racist figure, the incompetent and reactionary Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. And I should just pause for a moment here. Morris keeps focusing on do the Arabs hate the Jews? Doesn't have the fact that we have plenty of video footage of Jews dancing in the streets saying, we will burn their schools, a family going into a trial asking about a baby that was burned. Where is this kid? This kid is burning on a barbecue, burning in the fire or whatever. So Morris mentions all of this like, oh, well, all this evidence of Arab hatred of the Jews. He doesn't mention one instance of Jewish hatred of Arabs, which we have videos of. He's citing sources and studies and books, but we have video evidence. We have video evidence over and over and over of great hatred of the Palestinians by Zionist Jews. Morris doesn't mention this, not once. She maintains about the Grand Mufti, he was never a leader of more than a few reactionary Palestinian factions. His primary accomplishment was to sideline and obscure for history those Arab factions that sought coexistence with the Jewish Zionist movement. Not to excuse al-Husseini, but to contextualize him, we also might recall that various Zionists, including the Haganah, also attempted ineffectually to collaborate with Hitler in the 1930s on the opposite agenda. And once again, you got to give credit to Morris. He notes the Zionist-Nazi collaboration, and he would be unpopular in Israel for taking the time to say that, but he says it. It's appreciated. The sheer quantity of untruths in the passage above is striking, even by Tilly Land standards. Al-Husseini was the head of Palestine's Supreme Muslim Council between 1922 and 1948, and the head of the Arab Higher Committee during 1936 to 1939, and again in 1946 to 48. And during the 1930s and 40s, he was recognized by both the Arab masses of Palestine and the neighboring Arab governments, as well as by the British Mandate government and by the Jewish authorities in Palestine, as the leader of the Palestinian national movement. And I put an exclamation mark originally in the margin because the British specifically created a feud between the Nashashibi family and the al-Husseini family to divide the Palestinians. There was no national Palestinian government. They were not allowed to evolve, as the Jewish Agency was, into a preparatory body for government. They were divided by the British on purpose. And so he then, for whatever reason, Morris is just trying to rewrite history and saying, oh, al-Husseini was the undisputed leader of the Palestinian people. That is not true. No Palestinian historian or commentator disputes this. A number of them would. To claim now he represented merely a few reactionary Palestinian factions, that's probably going too far. He says, is plain mendacity. It is probably an oversimplification, but to say that he was the undisputed leader of the Palestinian people, he did aspire to be that, but in many cases he was a figurehead. Second, there were no Arab factions that sought coexistence with the Jewish Zionist movement. Well, this is ignoring the work by Judah Magnus and other Arab Jews who wanted to work for some kind of movement, and also American anti-Zionists who didn't want Israel to triumph in the way that Israel did. No Arab party during the 1930s and 1940s sought coexistence. Why was that? What's the context, Benny? All sought to crush the Yishuv and rule all of Palestine themselves, though a minority may occasionally have temporized or sought tactical, short-term accommodations. Last, the Haganah, to the best of my knowledge, never sought to, quote, collaborate with the Nazis in the 1930s. There was one extremist Zionist paramilitary or terrorist group, the LHI or Stern Gang, who are praised in Israeli history. So extremist Zionist paramilitary, national heroes of Israel, with some 300 to 500 members. with no popular backing. In the 1949 Knesset elections, the Lehigh Veterans Party won no seats because they were squeezed out by Ben-Gurion, which sought an alliance with the Germans during 1939 to 1940 in order to jointly fight against and throw out of Palestine what they regarded as the British imperialists. The Nazis, of course, refused to have anything to do with them. Last, Tilly argues, in any case, the flamboyant rhetoric used by Arab leaderships in the 1960s to encourage expelling the Jews is long gone. It had not been heard in any public forum for 20 years until ominously it was whipped up among extremist Islamic sectors by the U.S. occupation of Iraq in 2003. Now, although it is true that the PLO leadership since the 1960s has learned the arts of verbal restraint and ambiguity, Tilly apparently has never heard of Hamas, which continues to exercise far fewer inhibitions of this sort. Although it is true the leadership does refrain from using explicit phrases like throwing the Jews into the sea. If you'd like to learn more about Hamas, I've done a review of a book on them by Tareq Baconi. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. Nonetheless, to charge Washington with responsibility for recent Palestinian expulsionist thinking, as embodied in the Hamas Covenant and the Fatah Constitution, is a rank absurdity. Tilly may not like America's war in Iraq, but neither of these documents was inspired by anything that happened in or was done by the United States. If you are enjoying this content, please consider hitting like, subscribe. It's a way for people to learn more about what is going on about Palestine because you share it in the algorithm. But to return to demography, regarding the potential for a binational solution, matters have changed for the worse since the 1930s in other ways, for the worse. As the Muslim population of the Palestine Arab population has grown, and grown more devout, so the proportion of Christians, the more westernized and, quote, liberal among the Arabs, has steadily diminished. It now stands at less than 5%. Christian Arab families have tended to have fewer children and proportionally have emigrated in far greater numbers to the west and out of the conflict. At the same time, the massive immigration of Jews from Islamic lands to Israel in the late 1940s, 50s, and 60s has increased the Sephardi proportion of the Jewish population. This has had a double effect. On one hand, the country's Jewish community to a degree has been orientalized, for example, in cuisine and various aspects of public behavior. This might have helped pave the way to binationalism via some shared values, the centrality of family and clan, for example, among Israeli Sephardis, at least of the first immigrating generation, with the Palestinian Arabs. But these orientalizing factors have been offset by the psychological and ideological baggage these immigrants brought with them, in which they passed down to their children and grandchildren, which contained an essential hatred for the Arabs, taught to them by the new Israeli state, stemming from the discrimination and occasional violence they had suffered in the Muslim-majority countries from whence they had come, after 1948, before which time they had lived together in peace, and commensurate hardline anti-Arab politics and voting patterns once in Israel. Because they were taught to hate their Arab background, they were taught to hate that they had anything to do with it, that they listened to Arabic music, they spoke Arabic, that they liked Arabic food. The discrimination against the Sephardic Jews who came from Arab countries is documented, and Morris is glossing over all of this. At the same time, the second, third, and fourth generations of Sephardi descent have gradually been westernized, distancing them in terms of values from the Arab societies of their familial origin. Today, most Israeli Jews, both Ashkenazi and Sephardi, look to the West for their values, ideas, markets, holidays, books, movies, music, and television shows. A second demographic change on the Jewish side, speeded up by the events of 1967, was the vast increase in the proportion of ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews in the overall population, and the decline in the proportion of secular Jews, who are generally more liberal and open-minded than their religious compatriots. This change has been reflected in the steady growth of ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox political representation and power in both Labor and Likud-led coalition governments. For example, in Jerusalem, Israel's most populous city at 650,000 inhabitants, the demographic changes have resulted in the election, for the first time in 2003, of an ultra-Orthodox mayor with an ultra-Orthodox Orthodox majority in the municipal council. The Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox are generally hardliners on Arab-related issues and prone to expansionist and racist thinking. The large 1 million strong wave of immigrants who arrived in Israel from the Soviet Union and its former component republics in the late 1980s and 1990s, with the collapse of communism, injected a large secular population into the Jewish demographic tableau. But this has not appreciably aided the cause of binationalism. The Soviet Olim tended to bring with them hardline, right-wing political instincts. Among the Russian Jews in Israel, there will be few takers for the binational paradigm. They and their parents endured anti-Semitism and saw quite enough of life among, alongside, and under the Gentiles. For them, the Arabs are just a new version of Gentiles and ones for whom they generally have contempt. Again, helped along by the Israeli state. Despite some of the foregoing, Israeli Jewish society remains largely secular, with Western democratic values predominating. These can hardly dovetail with the authoritarian and religious values of Palestine Arab society, which is moving steadily toward greater religiosity. Why is that? Because as they continue to push down, hope in God is all that these people have, and then that ties into a religious political party that's tied together with that. We don't know that those conditions will prevail if there is one democratic state. 40 years ago, few Arab women in the territories and inside Israel wore scarves or veils. Today, they are the norm. Decades ago, there were functioning cinema houses in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Today, there are none. The second-class status of women and the ostracism, indeed vilification of homosexuals, are norms in West Bank and Gaza society, as in most of the Arab world, and honor killings, both in Israeli Arab society and in the Palestinian territories, of wives, sisters, daughters, for infringing traditional behavioral or dress codes, or for flirting with the wrong males, let alone for sleeping with them, are common. These are not the norms of Israeli Jewish society. No, the norms of Israeli Jewish society are murdering men, women, and children who are unarmed in their beds at night with bombs. Notice the focus on, yes, are there honor killings that happen? 100%. Is it lamentable? 100%. Is it something that the majority of Palestinian society would condone? I don't know. There is certainly a segment that does. It's been documented in various books I've read that honor killings do happen. But notice, he says these are not the norms of Israeli Jewish society, as if Israeli Jewish society is this moral society that the world looks to for an example. Hamas, an anti-democratic organization, despite being democratically elected in one of the freest elections in the Arab world, as noted by President Jimmy Carter, which he wrote about in Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. Demonstrated in the June 2007 takeover of the Gaza Strip that it has no respect for what are accepted in the West as civilized values. They shot captured Fatah men in the knees and then threw them off tall buildings, and will discard even their semblance as a snake sheds its skin the moment they prove inconvenient. So again, Morris doesn't give us any context here. The U.S. was plotting along with Fatah and Israel for a coup in Gaza to overturn the democratic election. So Gaza was being safeguarded by Hamas for the results of the election. Israel refused to accept it, colluded with the U.S. and Fatah to try to stage a takeover. Hamas preempted that takeover. And this question of throwing them off tall buildings, there was a man who fell out of a building trying to escape. And this has now turned into the story of men being thrown off tall buildings. There's no documentation of this, but it's easy to repeat. And as we've said on this channel, and as the famous proverb has said before, a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its trousers on. So here, it's found its way into a book with Morris. The mindset and basic values of Israeli Jewish society and Palestinian Muslim society are so different and mutually exclusive as to render a vision of binational statehood tenable only in the most disconnected and unrealistic of minds. In theory, sure, Benny, but people in Texas and New York strangely still live together in the United States. As an American, I marvel how that's possible. But it's clearly possible that people who totally disagree with each other on almost every single issue can still live together in a society. It doesn't mean that it's good or that it's desirable, but it is possible. The value placed on human life and the rule of secular law is completely different as exhibited in Israel itself. Yeah, there is no value placed on human life in Israel. Only Jewish life. That's the only life that matters. Everything else is nothing. The vast hiatus between Jewish and Arab perpetration of crimes, once again true, but not for the reasons that Morris would assert here, the Jewish perpetration of crimes far exceeds any Arab perpetration of crimes. Lethal road traffic violations. Arabs, to put it simply, proportionally commit far more crimes, and only ones connected to property, and commit far more lethal traffic violations than do Jews. This is simply not true. We have evidence. The thing is, when Morris wrote this in 2008, I think. 2009. Morris writes this in 2009. We have social media now, Benny. We have evidence. We have video evidence of all of the crimes committed by Israeli settlers. So this assertion even if it were somehow statistically provable in 2009, is certainly not true now. In large measure, this is a function of different value systems, such as the respect accorded to human life and the rule of law. How can someone say with a straight face that Israel has respect for human life and respect for the rule of law? Israeli society has respect for neither human life nor the rule of law. And to those contrasting value systems must be added the different, often conflictual, collective memories and the histories of the two societies, their different languages and cultures, and the large economic and educational gap that separates them. Each of these alone would probably constitute an insuperable barrier to successful binationalism. Look at contemporary Belgium, which seems to be heading for partition over little more than language. He said that in 2009. Somehow Belgium, with two very different people, still manages to be together. I also, once again, say, is that desirable? Probably not. But they have a situation where they could separate into two geographical entities. He is the one who's saying that it's not possible for a two-state solution, and the two-state solution is dead on arrival anyway because Israel has never wanted it. And of course, there are the political, ideological obstacles. On the Jewish side, there is an insurmountable basic problem. Zionism set out to solve the Jewish problem by establishing a Jewish polity, inhabited and governed largely, if not solely, by Jews, a place where Jews could at long last not live as a minority in someone else's house by his leave. And Zionism achieved this in 1948, a Jewish majority state. 60 years on, Israel's Jews overwhelmingly still want this and refuse to share sovereignty in their state with another people, and certainly will fiercely resist any attempt to turn them into a minority in which they regard as their own land. So have more children, or bring in more Jews. Nothing's to stop it from Jews increasing in population. It's just that Muslims have more children. They're about at parity now. There's as many Jews as Muslims in the entire area, what is called Israel and what are the occupied territories. Most Israeli Jews believe that this would be the end result of the establishment of a binational state, given greater Arab birth rates and the potential mass return of Palestinian refugees. It's the reality of things. You can't preserve what you have now, because what you have now is a racist apartheid supremacist state. There are going to be consequences for it changing. You're not going to be able to keep everything you have. And if you're a minority in your own land, then you can always try a project somewhere else where you can buy the land and move in. That's not what you did, and the crime is catching up with you no matter how. You can't keep on to the crime. It says, well, we've held on to this crime for 70 years, so now the crime has expired. The crime has been following you. The crime is in public in front of everybody, and you're going to have to account for the crime at some point, and that will require sacrifice. From the Arab side, the rejectionism is at least equally comprehensible and deeply felt. The idea of sharing Palestine, as indeed the sharing of any Muslim Arab land with non-Muslims and non-Arabs, either through a division of the country into two states, one Jewish, the other Arab, or through a unitary binational entity based on political parity between the two communities, is alien to the Muslim Arab mindset. Since the 7th and 8th centuries, when the Hijazi tribes swept out of Arabia and conquered the largely Christian Middle East and North Africa as far west as southern France, Muslim Arabs have been dominant by law and by force in their social and political environment, even when, as in the early years of the Islamic surge, the Muslim Arabs were in a minority. And following the conquest of non-Arab areas, the Muslim Arabs have, in the long run, sought to attain a majority through forced conversion, slaughter, and or expulsion. From the 8th or 9th centuries, Muslim Arabs have been politically dominant in the Islamic world and have grown accustomed to that position. The notion of sharing power or being a minority in a non-Muslim Arab polity is alien to the Muslim Arab mentality. In the Muslim Arab world, there have never been binational or bireligious political structures. There are only polities where Muslim Arabs are masters or were in a minority, where they aspire to attain majority and mastery. Certainly, there will have to be adjustment for the Palestinians as well. The only way this happens is by both parties being unhappy in some ways. That's when you know a compromise works. Both people have to give up something. You can't please everybody in such a complicated situation as this. But both parties will have to give something up in order to make this work. But one, as more states geographically, it makes sense that is one land, and the way that the land is cut together with the river, with the sea, with the desert, it makes sense for it to be one country. And that's what I hope for. Morris raises some legitimate objections. He glosses over other problems which he asserts are real problems without giving context. But I think in the long run, even from 2009 to now, 2025, one democratic state has always been a possibility, The fact is, Israel doesn't allow there to be any possibility in which Palestinians are treated as human beings. Whether it's a two-state solution, one-state solution, it means one state, two states. Morris forgets to add no state. That's effectively what is the implication is of the current situation. There'll be no state. This will always be what it is, and Israel will be held back forever. Because you have to think about it in the practical order. Israel can't move forward because all it does is fight wars and kill people. Is that really what Morris wants as a legacy for the great Jewish state? I've already said in numerous other reviews, I don't think Herzl would be very proud of what Israel is now, given his idealism and the fact that Israel is only kept together by rape and murder. So one state, two states, potentially no states. Benny Morris, if you'd like to get a copy of the book, as I always say, part of what we're doing on Palestine Bookshelf is not just reading things that make us comfortable and edify us, but also things that we don't like to read or may disagree with, because it's important to understand the arguments of the people you're opposed to. If you don't understand their arguments, how are you going to argue against them? So, Zionist historian, Israeli, Benny Morris, should be read. Whether you agree or disagree, he is, in many cases, the only person who has done research into a particular type of category. And that's why I think he should be read. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, there's a link in the description. It's one of the ways you can support this channel. Free way you can support this channel, as I've already alluded to before. Like, subscribe, share this with people who would like to hear alternative viewpoints and learn more about what's really going on in Palestine. If you'd like to thank me for this presentation, there's links to Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal below, as well as a link to Patreon and YouTube membership if you'd like to support me on an ongoing basis. If you do that, you'll get early access to reviews like this one. You'll have a chance to chat with me behind the scenes, and you'll also have the opportunity to see videos that I don't release to the general public that are just for my patrons and my members. If you'd like to nominate a book for the future, my Amazon wish list is linked below. You can browse through. You'll see different types of books. Books for my Stephen Heiner channel, which you're welcome to visit. Books on France and Paris for a project I work on called The Americans in Paris. Books on Palestine are obviously for this channel. If you buy a copy and send it to me, I will do my best to review it in a timely manner. Reminder that as we move towards monetization for the channel, we hope to put 100% of the profits of the channel towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. You'll see a link for them in the description. Go visit them, potentially support them directly right now. They help Palestinian children get medical care who could not otherwise get it. But you can support them indirectly by helping us get monetized and watching as many videos as you can in the meantime. Until next time, enjoy your reading.